There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the plain clothes of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, and they slip into the timeline of your memory without any fanfare. It's only later, when you trace the map of your own heart, that you find the pin marking the spot. This is where everything changed. You realize that the tectonic plates of your world had shifted, not with a violent tremor, but with a slow, silent groan that you mistook for the settling of an old house. For me, that moment smelled like stale pizza and Caleb's laundry detergent, a sin I had known for years but which had suddenly acquired the weight of a sacrament. He was asleep, his head a heavy, trusting weight on my shoulder, his breathing a slow tide against my collarbone. The television murmured on, casting shifting blue light across the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, forgotten constellations. It was the 17th time in 2 months he had fallen asleep on my couch, and my body had learned the cartography of his slumber. The initial twitch of his fingers, the way his brow would furrow and then smooth, the soft exhale that signaled his surrender to dreams. And in the quiet geography of that moment, with the city a distant, muffled roar outside my window, a single, terrifying thought bloomed in the silence of my mind. I was no longer waiting for him to wake up. I was waiting for him to stay. We had met in water. That's how I always thought of it. The chlorinated ether of the university pool was our genesis, a womb of blue tiles and echoing shouts where friendships were forged in the crucible of lactic acid and shared exhaustion. I was a diver, more comfortable with the silent fall through the air and the clean slice into the water than the chaotic churn of a freestyle race. My world was one of controlled arcs and quiet entry. Caleb was the opposite. He was a creature of pure momentum, a freestyler whose power seemed to come from the very core of the earth. He didn't enter the water. He commanded it, churning it into a white froth that followed in his wake like a testament to his strength. I used to watch him from the high dive, a tiny god of the 3-meter board, and see him as a force of nature, an ocean current given human form. He was all bright energy and easy laughter on the pool deck, his wet hair plastered to his forehead, his smile a flash of white against his sun-kissed skin. He collected people effortlessly, drawing them into his orbit with an unstudied charisma that I, in my quiet observational post, could only marvel at. Our friendship began not with a grand gesture, but with a series of small, accumulated kindnesses. It started with him noticing I always forgot my goggles and leaving a spare pair in my locker. It grew with him saving me a seat on the bus to away meets, the two of us sharing earbuds and listening to music that was always his choice, but which I grew to love because it became the soundtrack to his proximity. He was the one who dragged me to team dinners, who insisted I was part of the boisterous, backslapping ecosystem of the swimmers, even though I felt more like an adjacent species. I was the quiet one, the observer with a camera, perpetually documenting the moments I never quite felt a part of. My camera was my shield and my translator, a way to engage with the world from a safe distance. I took pictures of the way light fractured on the surface of the pool, the strain in a swimmer's back at the turn, the explosion of water as a body hit the surface. And I took pictures of Caleb. Hundreds of them. Caleb laughing with the coach. Caleb staring down his lane with an intensity that hollowed my stomach. Caleb asleep on the bus, his head against the vibrating window, utterly vulnerable in a way he never was when he was awake. I told myself it was for the art of it, for capturing the peak of human physicality, but my hard drive told a different story. It was a library dedicated to the study of a single, unwitting subject. It was a catalog of my own quiet, hopeless adoration. My feelings for him were a room I had built inside myself, a place I went to be alone. It was a well-furnished room, decorated with years of carefully collected memories and observations, but its door was always locked. I had accepted its existence as a fundamental part of my own architecture, a load-bearing wall of my interior life. To knock it down would be to risk the collapse of everything. Because our friendship, the real, tangible thing that existed outside that locked room, was my most prized possession. After graduation, when the structured world of collegiate sports dissolved, our bond was one of the few things that solidified. We ended up in the same city, him as a software engineer for a burgeoning tech company, me as a freelance photographer struggling to turn art into a living. We were the constants in each other's changing lives. He was the one I called when a client stiffed me on a payment. I was the one he called to help build his ridiculously complex IKEA furniture. Our friendship was an easy, settled thing, a comfortable silence that could fill a room without demanding to be broken. And then there was Sarah. She was lovely, bright and funny and ambitious, a perfect match for the Caleb the world saw. She worked in marketing, and her energy was a match for his. They were a golden couple, the kind of pair who looked like they'd been cast in a commercial for a life I could never imagine living. I liked her genuinely. She was kind to me, always including me, always asking about my work with an interest that seemed sincere. I became the designated third wheel, the reliable friend who was always there for their housewarmings, their Super Bowl parties, their casual weeknight hangouts. I photographed their joy. I captured their easy intimacy, the way she would rest her hand on the back of his neck, the way he would look at her across a crowded room. Each click of the shutter was a small, sharp pain, a confirmation of the unbridgeable distance between my secret room and the world he lived in. But I did it because being his friend, even in that capacity, was better than not being his friend at all. I learned to live with the low, constant ache of it. It became a background hum, like tinnitus of the heart. You only noticed it in the quietest moments. For 3 years, I perfected the performance of the supportive, platonic best friend. I gave him advice on birthday gifts for her. I listened to him talk about their future, about rings and houses in the suburbs. And with every word, I added another layer of soundproofing to the walls of my secret room, ensuring no one, especially not him, could ever hear what was inside. The shift began with a phone call on a rainy Tuesday in October. I remember the rain because it was lashing against my apartment window with a theatrical fury, and I was trying to edit a set of photos from a wedding, struggling to impose a sense of manufactured sunshine onto a day that had been stubbornly gray. My phone buzzed, and Caleb's name flashed on the screen. I smiled, expecting a call to complain about a bug in his code or to propose a last-minute plan for pizza. His voice, when I answered, was not the one I was used to. It was thin, frayed at the edges, like a rope stretched to its breaking point. "Hey," he said, and the single word was so devoid of his usual warmth that an alarm went off somewhere deep inside me. "Caleb? What's wrong? You sound off." There was a long silence on the other end, filled only with the sound of his unsteady breathing. I could picture him perfectly, pacing his pristine apartment, the one Sarah had decorated, running a hand through his hair, his jaw tight. He was a man who deflected discomfort with a joke and deflected pain with silence. This was a silence of the second kind. "It's over," he finally said, and the words were clipped, brittle. "Sarah and me. It's done." I felt a complex, ugly cocktail of emotions swirl in my gut. There was a shocking, shameful surge of something that felt terrifyingly like hope, followed immediately by a wave of guilt so profound it made me feel sick. And beneath it all was a deep, aching sympathy for my friend, for the genuine pain I heard in his voice. The pain was the only emotion I allowed myself to acknowledge. "Oh, Caleb, I'm so sorry. What happened?" "I don't even know, man," he choked out, and I could hear the dam breaking. "It was everything. Nothing. The future. The little things. It just fell apart. She said we want different things. Maybe we do. I don't know what I want." He paused, and then his voice dropped to a near whisper. "She's gone, Liam. She packed her stuff this afternoon. The apartment is so empty my heart broke for him." It was a clean, uncomplicated ache. The quiet photographer who loved him from afar was eclipsed by the friend who just wanted to fix this. "Where are you now?" I asked. "I'm just sitting here. On the floor. Don't move," I said, my voice firm, the decision made before I was even aware of making it. "I'm coming over." When he opened the door, he looked like a shipwreck. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. His hair was a mess, and he was wearing a wrinkled t-shirt and sweatpants that I knew were his give-up-on-the-day clothes. The apartment behind him was starkly, unnervingly neat. Sarah had been a whirlwind of color and texture, filling the space with bright pillows, art books, and little personal trinkets. Now, the surfaces were bare. The walls seemed to echo. It was a home that had been surgically hollowed out, left clean and sterile and empty. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, and then he seemed to collapse inward, his shoulders slumping as he leaned against the doorframe. I stepped inside and did the only thing that felt right. I pulled him into a hug. He was stiff at first, resistant, and then he just melted against me, burying his face in my shoulder. And for the first time since I'd known him, Caleb cried. Not quiet, dignified tears, but ragged, wrenching sobs that shook his entire body. I just held him, my hand on the back of his head, feeling the tremors run through him, the quiet observer suddenly at the epicenter of the earthquake. That night marked the beginning of the new cartography. He couldn't stand to be in his own apartment, a place that had become a museum of his failed relationship. So he came to mine. My place was the antithesis of his, a chaotic but comfortable loft filled with stacks of books, camera equipment, and prints in various stages of development hanging from clips. It was a space that was entirely, unapologetically mine. He arrived with a duffel bag containing a toothbrush and a change of clothes, looking like a refugee seeking asylum. I set him up on the couch, gave him my softest blanket, and made him a cup of tea he didn't touch. We didn't talk much. I put on some ambient, instrumental music, and we sat in the dim light of my living room, the silence a shared space rather than an empty one. He stared at the wall, his gaze distant, and I pretended to read a book, my eyes scanning the same paragraph over and over, my awareness entirely focused on the broken man sitting 10 feet away from me. Around midnight, his eyes started to droop. I should probably head back, he mumbled, though he made no move to get up. Don't be an idiot, I said, my tone softer than my words. You can't sleep there tonight. Just stay on the couch. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a gratitude so raw it was painful to see. You sure? I'm sure, I said. Get some sleep. He nodded, and without another word, he lay down, pulling the blanket up to his chin. I turned off the main lights, leaving only a small lamp burning in the corner, and retreated to my bedroom. I left my door ajar, a habit from years ago when we were roommates for a summer in college. It was an unspoken signal. I'm here if you need me. I lay in my own bed, listening to the unfamiliar sound of another person breathing in my apartment. I listened for a long time, hearing him shift and sigh, the quiet sounds of a restless grief. And I felt the walls of my secret room begin to feel thin, porous. His pain was seeping through. This was the beginning of the ritual. It wasn't a conscious decision made by either of us. It was a pattern that emerged from necessity and deepened into a habit. Caleb would go to his empty apartment after work, try to exist in the echoing space for an hour or two, and then I'd get a text. Hey, you up? Or what are you doing? Or, sometimes, just a single, lonely question mark. And I would always reply with the same invitation. Come over. He would arrive at my door looking depleted, the confident energy that had always defined him drained away, leaving behind a quiet, weary man I was only just getting to know. He was a coastline eroded by a relentless storm, and my small, cluttered apartment had become his unlikely harbor. The first few times, he slept on the couch. I would make sure he had pillows and a blanket, and I'd retreat to my room, leaving the door cracked open. But the couch was old and lumpy, and he was too tall for it. I'd hear him tossing and turning all night. One morning, I found him standing in my kitchen at dawn, his back rigid with pain, trying to work a kink out of his neck. His face was pale, shadowed with exhaustion. He looked worse than he had the day before. The sight of him, so physically uncomfortable on top of his emotional turmoil, twisted something in my chest. He was trying so hard to keep it together, to not be a burden, and it was clearly breaking him. That night, when he arrived, I met him at the door with a fresh set of sheets. You're not sleeping on that torture device again, I said, nodding toward the couch. Take my bed. I'll take the couch. He immediately started protesting. No, man, I can't do that. It's your bed. I'm the one imposing. It's not an imposition, I argued, trying to keep my voice steady, betraying none of the frantic fluttering in my own chest at the thought of him in my bed. It's just practical. You need to actually sleep. You look like a ghost. I can sleep anywhere. Please, Caleb. Just for tonight. He hesitated, his gaze searching mine, looking for something. Pity, maybe, or annoyance. I tried to project nothing but simple, friendly concern. Finally, he relented with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire world. Okay, but just for tonight, of course, it wasn't just for that night. The next night, he tried to argue for the couch again, but his protest was weaker, and I was more insistent. It became the new arrangement. He would take my bed, and I would take the couch, and we would exist in this strange, inverted domesticity. I would lie awake on the lumpy cushions, listening to the quiet sounds of him settling into my sheets, surrounded by my scent, my things. The thought was both agonizing and intoxicating. My room, my most private space, was now his sanctuary. He was sleeping in the very heart of my world, and he had no idea. I spent those nights in a state of hyper-awareness, my senses tuned to every creak of the mattress, every sigh. I was a watchman guarding a precious, sleeping treasure, and the proximity was a slow, sweet poison. The ritual evolved again about a week later. I had woken up in the middle of the night, my back aching from the couch, and padded into the kitchen for a glass of water. As I passed my open bedroom door, I glanced in. Caleb was thrashing in his sleep, his limbs tangled in the duvet, his face contorted in distress. He let out a small, wounded sound, a whimper that cut through the silence and went straight to my heart. He was having a nightmare, reliving some fresh hell in the landscape of his subconscious. Without thinking, I moved into the room and sat on the edge of the bed. I didn't know what to do. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering in the air, before I gently placed it on his shoulder. "Caleb," I whispered. "Hey, it's okay. You're dreaming." His turmoil didn't cease, but it lessened. He shifted, turning toward my touch in his sleep. The sound he made this time less like a whimper and more like a sigh. The tension in his body seemed to drain away under the simple pressure of my hand. I stayed there for a long time, just sitting in the dark, my hand on his shoulder, until his breathing deepened into the slow, even rhythm of peaceful sleep. I finally retreated back to the couch, but the brief contact had left an imprint on my skin, a phantom warmth that lingered until morning. I had crossed a small, invisible line, and the world had not ended. The next night, I was woken by a different sound. It was the soft creak of my bedroom door opening further, and then footsteps. I opened my eyes to see Caleb's silhouette standing in the dim light, filtering in from the street. "Liam?" he whispered, his voice thick with sleep. I sat up, my heart starting a frantic, muffled drumbeat against my ribs. "Yeah? What's up? Another nightmare?" He shook his head, though I could barely see the motion in the dark. "No, I can't sleep. The bed feels too big." He paused, and the vulnerability in his next words was staggering. "It's too empty." I understood immediately. He wasn't just missing Sarah. He was missing the simple, primal comfort of another human presence beside him in the dark. He had slept next to someone for 3 years. The sudden, absolute solitude was a physical presence, a cold void in the space beside him. My own bed, the couch, the floor, they all felt miles away. I made a decision in that moment, a choice that felt both monumentally reckless and completely inevitable. "Come here," I said, my voice raspy. I shifted over on the couch, making a space for him. It was a small space. A ridiculously, impossibly small space. He didn't hesitate. He crossed the room and lay down on the narrow couch beside me, his back to mine. We were pressed together from shoulder to knee, two bodies crammed onto a piece of furniture meant for one. The heat from his back seeped through my t-shirt, a startling, electric warmth. Neither of us spoke. We just lay there, rigid and silent, breathing in unison. My mind was screaming. It was a cacophony of terror and elation. He was here. He was right here. His warmth was real. His presence was undeniable. I lay perfectly still, terrified that if I moved, if I even breathed too deeply, I would shatter the fragile, unbelievable reality of the moment. After what felt like an eternity, I felt the tension in his body begin to release. His breathing slowed and deepened. He had found his anchor in the dark. And I, the anchor, lay awake until dawn, terrified and thrilled, feeling the steady rise and fall of his back against mine. That was the night the couch became our bed. The pretext of him taking my room and me taking the couch was abandoned without a word. It was simply understood. At the end of the night, we would both gravitate to the living room, and he would lie down, and I would lie down beside him, and we would sleep pressed together in the dark. It was a choreography of unspoken need. His need for comfort, for a warm body to ward off the ghosts in his empty apartment, and my need, so deep and so old, to simply be near him. Our nights took on a new rhythm. The initial rigidity gave way to a slow, tentative acceptance of the proximity. One night, he shifted in his sleep and his arm fell across my waist. I stopped breathing, certain he would wake up and pull away, embarrassed. But he didn't. He just sighed, a soft, contented sound, and snuggled closer, his face nuzzling into the space between my shoulder blades. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. I lay there, pinned by the casual, unconscious intimacy of his touch, and felt a profound, aching tenderness that was almost unbearable. The ritual became our secret language. We never spoke of it in the daylight. In the morning, we would untangle ourselves with a careful, deliberate casualness. We'd make coffee, talk about work, about the news, about anything other than the fact that we had spent the night wrapped around each other like vines. The daylight world was for our old friendship, the comfortable, platonic bond that was safe and defined. The night was for this new, unspoken thing, this fragile ecosystem of touch and proximity that we were building in the dark. I lived a strange, bifurcated existence. By day, I was Liam, Caleb's supportive best friend. By night, I was something else. I was his comfort, his human hot water bottle, his anchor. And I was a man living inside a dream he was terrified of waking up from. I began to document this new phase, too, but not with my camera. My mind became the lens, my memory the film. I captured the tiny details with a photographer's eye. The way the muscles in his back would relax, one by one, as he drifted off to sleep. The faint, clean scent of his shampoo on the pillow we now shared. The weight of his leg thrown over mine. A casual, possessive gesture that made my breath catch. The first time he turned to face me in his sleep, his breath warm against my neck. Each new development was a quiet explosion in my universe. I would analyze every gesture, every sigh, searching for meaning. Was this just about comfort for him? Was I just a convenient, warm body, a placeholder for the intimacy he'd lost? Or was it possible, just barely possible, that something else was taking root in the space between us? The hope was a dangerous, seductive thing. It was a tiny flame in a room filled with gasoline. I tended to it carefully, terrified it would either die out or erupt and burn everything to the ground. The physical space between us continued to shrink. What started as back-to-back sleeping evolved. He started turning to face me, tucking his head into the curve of my shoulder. It felt like the most natural thing in the world, his body fitting against mine as if designed for it. I learned to sleep with his arms slung over my chest, his hand resting just over my heart. I learned the exact rhythm of his breathing, the way it would catch sometimes in a dream. I was drowning in him, and it was the most peaceful, terrifying feeling I had ever known. I was living on a knife's edge of intimacy, a breath away from everything I had ever wanted, and a breath away from utter ruin. All it would take was one wrong move, one misread signal, and the delicate trust we had built in the dark would shatter. The friendship, the one thing that had been my constant for a decade, would be the first casualty. So I did nothing. I waited. I held my breath and let him lead, let his unconscious needs dictate the slow, inexorable closing of the distance between us. I became a master of stillness, a curator of the quiet moments, hoping that one day, the language we spoke in the dark would finally be translated into the light. The crossing happened on a Thursday. It was a day like any other, which is, of course, how these things always happen. It had been almost 3 months since the breakup, and our nightly ritual was as ingrained as brushing our teeth. He came over after a long day at work, looking frayed and exhausted. A big project was launching, and he'd been pulling 12-hour days for a week. He collapsed onto the couch before he'd even taken his shoes off. I ordered his favorite Thai food, and we ate out of the cartons while watching some mindless action movie. He barely spoke, his eyes glazed over, fixed on the screen, but seeing something else entirely. After we ate, he simply leaned his head against my shoulder and closed his eyes. "Tired?" I asked, my voice a low murmur. "Beyond tired," he mumbled into my shirt. "My brain feels like it's been wrung out like a sponge." We sat like that for the rest of the movie, his head on my shoulder, his breathing slowly evening out. The credits rolled, and the screen went black, plunging the room into a deeper quiet, broken only by the hum of the city outside. I didn't move. I barely breathed. He was so still, so heavy against me. I thought he was asleep. I was about to try and maneuver us into a more comfortable lying down position when he spoke, his voice soft and clear in the darkness. "Liam." "Yeah," I whispered back. He shifted, lifting his head from my shoulder. He didn't move away, though. He just adjusted his position so he was facing me, our knees bumping in the small space. The faint light from the window illuminated one side of his face, leaving the other in deep shadow. His eyes, dark and serious, were fixed on mine. My heart began a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. The air in the room suddenly felt thick, charged with a voltage I had never felt between us before. This was different. This wasn't the unconscious intimacy of sleep. This was awake. This was intentional. He just looked at me for a long time, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. I saw a universe of confusion and conflict, and something else, something that looked like yearning, in his eyes. It was a look I recognized, because I saw it in my own reflection every morning. "What is this?" he asked, and the question was so quiet, so vulnerable, it was almost carried away by the silence. I didn't know how to answer. What was it? It was everything. It was my secret made real. It was a comfort. It was a complication. It was a danger and a salvation. "I don't know, Caleb," I answered, my voice hoarse with a truth I couldn't speak. "It's us," he nodded slowly, as if that answer made a strange kind of sense to him. His eyes flickered down to my mouth and then back up to my eyes. The small movement was like a lit match in the charged air. My entire body went rigid with anticipation. This was it. This was the precipice. He leaned in, his movement achingly slow, closing the small gap between us. He stopped when his face was only inches from mine. I could feel the warmth of his breath on my skin. He was giving me time. Time to pull away, time to object, time to save us from this. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by a hope so fierce it felt like terror. "I've never done this before," he whispered, and his voice was raw with a confession that went far beyond the immediate moment. It was a confession of identity, of crossing a line he had never even known was there. And then he closed the remaining distance and kissed me. It wasn't a passionate, movie-perfect kiss. It was hesitant. It was searching. It was unbelievably soft. It was a question asked with his lips instead of his voice. His lips were tentative against mine, a gentle pressure that was more about discovery than demand. And in that single, feather-light touch, I felt the culmination of years of unspoken longing. I responded instinctively, my own lips softening against his, answering his question with a quiet yes. "Yes, this is real. Yes, this is happening." The hesitation melted away, and he kissed me again, deeper this time. There was a decade of friendship in that kiss, a deep, foundational knowledge of each other. But there was something new, too. A fragile, burgeoning tenderness. A sense of homecoming to a place neither of us had ever been before. He tasted like green curry and uncertainty and a longing that mirrored my own so perfectly it felt like I was kissing a part of my own soul. He kissed me like he was starving, and I was the first real food he'd had in years. He kissed me like he'd wanted to forever. When he finally pulled back, the silence that fell between us was profound. It was a silence filled with the deafening sound of a line being crossed, a world being remade. He rested his forehead against mine, and I could feel a slight tremor running through him. We stayed like that, breathing the same air, our eyes closed, anchored to each other in the aftermath. The tectonic plates had not just shifted, they had crashed together, and the landscape of my life was forever changed. He had said he'd never done this before, but in that moment, it felt like the only thing either of us had ever done. It felt like the beginning of everything. The aftermath was not the gentle dawn I had foolishly dreamed of. It was a cold, gray morning thick with fog. The beautiful, honest silence that had followed the kiss dissipated almost immediately. Caleb pulled away from me, not just physically, but emotionally. He retreated to the far end of the couch, creating a chasm between us that felt miles wide. He wouldn't look at me. He just stared at his hands, which were clenched in his lap, his knuckles white. The air, which moments before had been electric with possibility, was now heavy with regret. I could feel it radiating from him like a palpable cold. I should go," he said, his voice flat and distant. He stood up abruptly, not waiting for my response. He grabbed his keys from the bowl by the door, his movements jerky and unnatural. "Caleb, wait," I said, my voice barely a whisper. My heart, which had been soaring, was now plummeting, a stone dropped into a deep, dark well. Can we talk about this?" He finally looked at me, and the expression in his eyes was one of pure, panicked confusion. It was the look of a man who had woken up in a foreign country with no memory of how he got there. I can't, he said, shaking his head. I don't. I don't know what to say. I'm sorry, Liam. I'm so sorry. And then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, and the sound was like a gunshot in the silent apartment. I was left alone on the couch, the phantom feeling of his lips still on mine, the warmth of his body rapidly fading from the space beside me. He was sorry. He was sorry for the single, most beautiful moment of my entire life. The hope that had bloomed so brightly just minutes before withered and died, turning to ash in my chest. I had misinterpreted everything. I wasn't a harbor. I was a temporary dry dock, a place for repairs. I was a stand-in, a convenience. The intimacy, the cuddling, the kiss, it wasn't about me. It was about his own loneliness, his own confusion. He hadn't been kissing me. He had been kissing the idea of not being alone. The realization was a brutal, physical pain. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. They were quiet. Caleb, who had been a constant, overwhelming presence in my life for months, simply vanished. My texts went unanswered for hours, and when he finally replied, it was with short, sterile phrases. Busy at work, can't tonight, talk later. The nightly ritual was broken. My apartment felt cavernous and empty without him. The couch, our shared island, was just a piece of furniture again, cold and impersonal. I found myself lying on it alone at night, trying to conjure the memory of his weight beside me, the ghost of his warmth. The silence he left behind was louder than any argument. It was a silence filled with his apology, a constant, ringing reminder of my foolishness. I fell into a spiral of self-recrimination. I replayed every moment of the past 3 months, every touch, every shared silence. But the footage was now tainted, re-edited through the lens of his regret. Had I pushed him? Had my own unspoken wanting somehow created a pressure he felt he had to respond to? I had been so careful, so still, but maybe my stillness itself was a kind of demand. The locked room inside me felt like it had been ransacked, its precious contents smashed and strewn about. The pain was twofold. I was mourning the loss of a future I had allowed myself to imagine for a few fleeting moments, and I was mourning the loss of the past, of the easy, uncomplicated friendship that now seemed irrevocably broken. I had lost him in every tense. After a week of this agonizing silence, I couldn't take it anymore. The ambiguity was eating me alive. I needed to know, even if the truth was the worst thing I could imagine. I needed to hear it from him. I needed the final, clean break, because this slow fading was unbearable. I drove to his apartment. I hadn't been there since the night of the breakup. Standing outside his door felt like visiting a ghost. I took a deep breath and knocked, my heart hammering against my ribs. He took a long time to answer. When he finally opened the door, he looked as exhausted as I felt. He was still in his work clothes, his tie loosened, his eyes shadowed. He looked surprised to see me, and not in a good way. "Liam," he said, his voice wary. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk, Caleb," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You can't just disappear. You can't kiss me like that, and then just vanish into thin air. You owe me more than that." He flinched at the word kiss, as if it were a physical blow. He sighed, a sound of pure defeat, and ran a hand over his face. "You're right," he said, his shoulders slumping. He stepped back, letting me in. His apartment was still sterile and neat, but now it felt less empty and more repressed. It was a space that was holding its breath. We stood awkwardly in the living room, a few feet apart, the silence stretching between us like a taut wire. "I am so sorry," he began, repeating the words that had been haunting me. "Stop saying that." I cut him off, my voice sharper than I intended. "I don't want your apology. I want an explanation. What the hell happened, Caleb? What was all of that? The nights on the couch, everything. And that kiss. What was it?" He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a desperate, swirling confusion. "I don't know," he said, and the words were a raw admission of defeat. "Liam, I swear to you, I don't know. Everything with Sarah, it gutted me. And you were there. You were just solid. You were quiet and calm, and you didn't ask for anything. Being at your place, being near you, it was the only time my brain would shut up. It was the only time I felt safe, so I was a sedative." I asked, the bitterness lacing my words. "A human tranquilizer?" "No," he said, stepping forward, his hands gesturing helplessly. "No, it wasn't like that. It was more. At first, maybe it was just about comfort. But then it changed. I don't know when. Lying there with you at night, it started to feel more necessary than just sleep. It felt right, in a way that nothing has felt for a long time. In a way that, if I'm being honest, it never even felt with Sarah. He stopped, looking horrified by his own admission. He started pacing the room, his agitation growing. And that night, I was looking at you, and I wasn't thinking. I just felt. I felt this overwhelming something. I can't even put a name to it. And I acted on it. I crossed a line. And the second I did it, I panicked. Because I'm not. That's not who I am. There it was. The core of it. The fear. He wasn't just afraid of our friendship changing. He was afraid of his entire identity changing. The kiss hadn't just broken a rule between us. It had broken a rule within him, a fundamental law of his own self-perception. He was Caleb, the swimmer, the guy's guy, the one who dated Sarah. The kiss had presented him with a version of himself he had never considered, and it terrified him. My anger began to subside, replaced by a wave of profound, weary sadness. He wasn't rejecting me. He was rejecting himself. Who you are? I asked quietly. Who is that, Caleb? Is that a person who's allowed to feel safe? Is that a person who's allowed to feel whatever it was you felt that night? Or is it just a collection of labels you've been carrying around for so long you're afraid to look at what's underneath them? He stopped pacing and stared at me, his mouth slightly open. He looked like I had just spoken to him in a language he was only beginning to understand. I took a step closer, my voice softening. I'm not going to lie to you. That kiss wasn't a mistake for me. It was something I've wanted for a very long time. Longer than you can imagine. My feelings for you aren't a result of your breakup. They're not new. They're the oldest, most consistent thing in my life. The confession hung in the air between us, a huge, terrifying, liberating truth. The door to my secret room was not just unlocked, it was wide open. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not panic this time, but a dawning awareness. The pieces were clicking into place for him. My constant presence, my quiet attention, the hundreds of photos, it was all being recontextualized for him in real time. But I can't live like this. I continued, my voice trembling slightly. I can't live in the silence you left me in for the past week. And I can't go back to being the person who just waits in the dark for you to need comfort. It's not fair to me. So you have to decide. You have to figure out what was real and what was just a reaction to being lonely. And you have to be honest with me, and more importantly, you have to be honest with yourself. But whatever you decide, you don't get to just disappear on me again. Our friendship, at the very least, deserves better than that. I had said my piece. I had laid all my cards on the table, leaving myself completely exposed. There was nothing left to do but wait for him to play his hand. He stood there for a long time, his gaze distant, his face a canvas of conflicting emotions. The silence was different this time. It wasn't empty or regretful. It was thoughtful. It was the sound of gears turning, of a lifetime of assumptions being re-examined. Finally, he looked at me, his eyes clear and direct for the first time since the kiss. You're right, he said, his voice quiet but firm. You're right about everything. I've been a coward. I was so scared of what it meant that I didn't stop to think about how it felt. And it felt like coming home. He took a deep breath, the sound of it filling the entire room. I don't know what this looks like, Liam. I don't have a map for this. I'm scared. But the thought of losing you completely, that's a hell of a lot scarier than figuring this out. Can we just start there? It wasn't a grand declaration of love. It wasn't a promise of a perfect future. It was something far more valuable. It was a shaky, terrified, honest beginning. And for the first time in a week, a tiny, resilient flicker of hope ignited in the wreckage of my heart. Okay, I said, a small, watery smile touching my lips. Okay, Caleb. We can start there. The resolution was not a sudden flood of light, but a slow, gentle sunrise. The conversation in his apartment didn't magically solve everything, but it cracked the door open for honesty. We started talking, really talking, for the first time. We didn't talk about labels or futures. We talked about feelings. He spoke of his fear, the disorienting sensation of having his own self-image upended. He admitted that the comfort he found with me was different from anything he'd known. It was quieter, deeper, a feeling of being seen and accepted without performance. I, in turn, spoke of my long-held affection, not as an accusation, but as a simple fact, a part of the landscape of our friendship he had never been able to see. It was a delicate, careful process, like developing a photograph in a darkroom, slowly watching the image emerge from the ether, terrified of exposing it to too much light too soon. The ritual returned, but it was different now. It was intentional. The first night after our talk, he came over to my apartment. There was an awkwardness at the end of the evening, a shared uncertainty about how to proceed. The couch loomed in the corner, a monument to our former ambiguity. "So," he said, breaking the silence. "The couch." I shook my head. "No more couch," I said softly. "It's killing my back." I looked toward my bedroom, my heart giving a nervous leap. "My bed is big enough for two. If you want." It was an invitation, not a presumption. He looked at me, a small, grateful smile on his face. "Yeah," he said, "I want." That night, we lay in my bed, face to face, with a few inches of careful space between us. There was no pretense of accidental touch. We were both awake, both aware. He reached out, his hand tentatively finding mine in the space between us. He laced his fingers through mine, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. It was a simple, deliberate gesture of connection that felt more intimate than any of the unconscious cuddling we had done before. We didn't sleep for a long time. We just lay there in the quiet dark, holding hands, learning the new shape of us. It was a silence born not of fear or uncertainty, but of peace. It was the beautiful, honest silence of two people who had finally found their way to the same room and had chosen, together, to close the door. Slowly, tentatively, we built our new normal. It was a quiet, domestic thing, constructed from small, everyday moments. It was him bringing over a toothbrush and leaving it in the mug by my sink. It was me clearing out a drawer for his clothes without him having to ask. It was the easy, unspoken rhythm of making coffee together in the morning, our bodies moving around each other in the small kitchen with a familiar grace that now held a new tenderness. He started staying over more nights than he didn't, until one day we realized he hadn't slept in his own apartment in over a month. We packed up his things on a sunny Saturday, the sterile, empty space feeling like a relic from another lifetime, a place that belonged to a version of him that no longer existed. The physical affection that had once been confined to the ambiguity of sleep now blossomed in the daylight. It was in the way he'd rest his hand on the small of my back as I was washing dishes. It was in the way I'd lean my head on his shoulder while we read on the couch. Kisses were no longer a source of panic, but a quiet, frequent punctuation to our days. They were soft kisses goodbye in the morning, gentle kisses hello in the evening, sleepy kisses in the middle of the night. Each one was a reaffirmation of the choice we were making, the choice to be this, together. One afternoon, I was in my makeshift darkroom, the red light casting an otherworldly glow on everything. Caleb came in and stood behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. We stood in silence, watching as I gently agitated a tray of developer, the image of a windswept coastline slowly, magically appearing on the paper. "It's amazing how you do that," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against my back. "How you can see something that isn't there yet, and just wait for it to appear." I smiled, leaning back into his embrace. The metaphor was not lost on me. My whole life, I had been the quiet observer, the one waiting patiently in the dark, watching, hoping for the true image to emerge. I had been developing a picture of us for years, and it had finally resolved into something clear and beautiful and real. The process had been slow, agonizing at times, but the result was worth every moment of waiting. We are a quiet couple. Our love is not a grand, declarative thing. It is a language spoken in shared glances, in the comfort of a familiar presence, in the simple, profound peace of knowing you have a safe harbor in the world. It is the steady warmth of his hand in mine, the sound of his breathing beside me in the dark, the easy rhythm of a life being built together, one ordinary, beautiful day at a time. There are moments in your life that you recognize as a turning point the very instant they happen. They are not disguised. They arrive with the full force of their own significance, a bright, clear light that illuminates everything. For me, that moment was not the first kiss, born of confusion and need. It was the first time we held hands in the dark, a conscious, deliberate choice to connect, to begin. That was the moment we stopped being two separate histories and started becoming a shared future. That was the moment we began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned, finally, to create together.